Good afternoon, everyone. We're now in Sentinel Hill Hall on the 11th floor of G. Fox & Company, where Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt is about to deliver a brief address opening an exhibit of Australian and Pacific Island paintings by Sylvia Davis Patricelli. This exhibit is being presented by G. Fox & Company and the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Hartford. And as a public service, G. Fox is bringing you this broadcast of Mrs. Roosevelt's remarks. She will be introduced by Mrs. Beatrice Fox Auerbach, president of G. Fox & Company. Mrs. Auerbach.
Good afternoon and welcome to Sentinel Hill Hall on behalf of the Wadsworth Athenaeum and G. Fox & Company, who take great pleasure in presenting today this exhibition of Australian and Pacific Island paintings by Sylvia Patricelli. It is our pleasure and my privilege to present to you this afternoon not only a talented young artist, but our guest of honor who has made this special trip to Hartford to open this exhibit. First, may I greet, especially from our many distinguished guests, the Consul General of Australia, Mr. E.K. Smart. Mrs. Lodge, who needs no introduction. Mr. Patricelli. And Susan. Mrs. Coleman. And Mr. Cunningham. Sylvia Patricelli is now a great and welcome addition to the cultural life of our community. She spent her girlhood in Australia, becoming a recognized painter in her native land, while still only in her early 20s. Today, as she moves forward in her career, we are happy to have this opportunity of viewing her creative work. And now, since the remarks of our guest of honor are to be broadcast as a public service by G. Fox & Company, to those unable to be here, I take great pleasure in presenting Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. Mrs. Roosevelt.
Ms. Auerbach, Ms. Patricelli, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure always to come to Hartford and to be here in this gathering, because always here there is something of interest going on for all the women of Connecticut. And I feel sure that today you are going to find great interest in the paintings by this young artist. Sylvia Patricelli has a real gift, I think, and I am much interested in young artists of every kind, because art is a language which the peoples of different nations and different cultures can understand without words. We may not all be able to talk, but we can see and we can hear, and it means a great deal to find that there is something which binds us, even when we do not understand each other's languages. And so I think you will find that in this exhibition, in the paintings from the Solomon Islands particularly, you will get an understanding of a part of the world and of the people in that part of the world which perhaps you've never had an opportunity of actually visiting. But it will mean more to you, and you will see it with new eyes because of the portraits. And for me, it's important to us as Americans that we should use art and learn through art, because we have a great deal to learn. We've been thrust into a position of leadership when we were hardly ready to assume it. As we go back through our history, of course, we know that at first we had so much to do in our own country that we could think of nothing but our own country. People came to us from all over the world, and as quickly as possible, we made them into Americans. And we've succeeded wonderfully well. I remember in the summer of '43, when I went to Australia and New Zealand and 17 Pacific islands, including Guadalcanal, I remember very well looking at camps of our boys, and as you look down a whole row of boys in uniform, you suddenly realize there was an American type. The names might come from every country in the world, but the boys were American boys, and you would have recognized them anywhere. So we did a wonderful job in developing a continent and amalgamating a people out of people from all over the world. But in our hurry to do that, we often forgot our heritages. We often forgot much of what came behind us. The first time I think we began to wake up to another part of the world was when we began to realize that South America was important to us. We began to realize that we didn't know too much about the culture of our own Indians, but we now had to learn about the culture of South American Indians. And then we had to learn about the people who lived in South and Central American countries. We didn't do too good a job of it for a long while. We're not doing too good a job of it yet. We're doing better, a great deal better, but not perfectly, not yet. And now suddenly there's coming about something which is probably going to mean a complete change in much of our education and in much of our thinking, because if we are going to lead in the world, we have to win not just through military strength, not even only through economic leadership, but through cultural and spiritual leadership and understanding the peoples of the world to a realization of what our type of civilization, of government, of life means, in contrast to what the Soviets have to offer. And don't fool yourselves. It's very much easier to sell the Soviet type of dictatorship than to sell the United States democracy. For this reason, that you are dealing with innumerable people in the world who far outnumber us, who have never known what freedom was. Their first thought is freedom to eat. Many of them have never had enough to eat. And you're dealing with a dictatorship which will say you will all live according to a certain pattern. This is what you will do. This is how you will eat. freedom will never be mentioned, because according to them, there is no real freedom. There's no such thing. But it will be freedom to eat to a large part of the world. And we have to sell. And before you can sell a thing, you have to thoroughly understand it. You have to live it. You have to perfect it as far as you possibly can with human nature as it is, where it can act as an example. That's why everything we do at home today is so important. That's why everything that happens here is of significance, not just here, but all over the world. We still behave in Congress, in our own country as a whole, exactly as though no one in the world was interested except ourselves. No one was paying any attention to what we said or did except ourselves. So we could say whatever we wanted to say. We could tell everybody where we made our failures, what mistakes we'd made, what things were going wrong. We would know that among us we would understand that we could correct those things, and we had to know about them. Now we have to think what effect that has in the world. In the last few weeks, I think we've probably given away more valuable information to people we would prefer not to have it, or at least that they had to dig for it, just calmly on a platter, because we don't realize that all the world listens to everything we say. We have no realization of that at all. And neither do we realize most of the time that all the world watches everything we do. And you just have to sit in a few UN meetings with 59 other nations to discover how well they know every single thing that happens in our country. It's probably the most responsible position a nation has ever been in, because the world's communication has become so easy. There's so many ways to communicate. We can see things and hear things more rapidly than we ever have before. And all of a sudden, we have this responsibility. We're not prepared for it very well. We forget it all the time. And now, having this responsibility, we have to measure up for it. And the best way to measure up is to understand it. And one of the ways to understand it is to use every means. And the arts are one of the ways. Therefore, I hope that you will study not just this exhibition, but many others, that you will listen to music from many lands, that you will take the opportunities of meeting the men and women who are here, not only students. It's a temptation to meet only students. But we should meet as many men and women and try to understand them and know about their countries, and try to explain to them our country. It's not easy. It's very hard. It's going to take sacrifice and determination before we get through, if we're going to sell democracy. But if we don't do it, the Soviets will do it. So you haven't much choice. Thank you.
You just heard Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt opening an exhibit of Australian and Pacific Island paintings by Sylvia Davis Patricelli. The exhibit in the club rooms adjoining Sentinel Hill Hall on the 11th floor of G. Fox & Company is being presented by the store and the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. Mrs. Roosevelt's address was brought to you as a public service by G.